And then finally, the last main theme that we want to bring out from the first section of Kant's fundamental principles of the metaphysics of morals is something that will actually be a major theme for the rest of our discussion of Kant. It's something he calls the supreme principle of morality, and later he calls it the categorical imperative. So this is the first presentation that he gives of this categorical imperative or supreme principle of morality, and I'll work my way to telling you more about exactly what that is. This is the centerpiece, the core of Kant's own ethical theory. So this is his answer to the question of how do we tell the difference between good and bad? This is the core component of that. This is the principle that will tell us, okay? It is the analog in the Kantian system of what the utilitarians called the principle of utility. Okay, so this is Kant's version of the supreme principle of morality, whereas the utilitarians have their version, which is the principle of utility. Kant's version is very different from the utilitarian utilitarian principle. Okay, Kant's idea about what ethics is about is very different from the utilitarian's idea about what ethics is about. So now we're going to dive in and look at this more closely. So Kant says a lot of things in the rest of the section, and some of it is quite confusing to read. And you might be scratching your head and saying, this is supposed to be the common sense, everyday notion of morality that we're working from? Yeah, it's pretty difficult. So what I want to do is just give you a basic framework for interpreting the things that he says. It doesn't mean that everything will become clear as a result of this, but it's at least highlighting a part of what he says that hopefully will be relatively understandable to you. Okay. So among the things that Kant says, out of all the things that Kant says, we can distill the following framework, okay, among other things. So one is that if there is such a thing as duty or obligations or what morality requires, okay, then it will take the form of what Kant calls a practical law, or what is an objective principle of volition. Now, a way to put that is it will have the form of you ought to do X, Y, or Z. Okay, so it will be something like a law in that it commands us. It will say you cannot do X and you should do Y, or when faced with situation X, you should do Y. So it's going to have some kind of format like that that looks like a law, even like a law that might be passed in a society, though what Kant means here is the moral law or the practical law rather than the practical law in the sense of laws of practice, laws of human action. So it will be that rather than, say, a societal law or the law in a legal system, or even a natural law like laws of physics. He means something different here. He means laws of morality. He sometimes calls it the moral law. So again, if there is such a thing as duty or obligation or what morality requires, then it will have this form of a practical law. Hold that on the shelf for a moment and let me talk about another major component, okay, which is what Kant calls a maxim. So a maxim is basically a rule or principle that guides the decision-making of a will. Okay, so Kant's idea is that all of the things that we do for some reason. There's some motive or some rule that we're following, a rule that we have ourselves adopted or set for ourselves, Kant would say, okay? But the point is that our actions can be understood as following a rule of a certain kind. Let me give you an example. So all of you right now are watching this video, right? And if I ask, why are you watching the video? It's not just an accident that you're watching the video, right? It's not like you just got up and you kind of bumped into a couple of objects in your room or wherever you are, and then your computer turned on and the video turned on, right? you deliberately opened up Canvas or however it is you're accessing these, and then you push play on the video and you're watching right now, okay? And so there must be a reason that you have as to why you're watching it. Maybe your maxim is something like this. I will watch all the videos in my, all the video lectures in my courses, okay? And since this is a video lecture in one of your courses, you're watching it. Another could be, I will do everything that I can in order to succeed in my college courses. And you understand that watching these videos will help you to succeed in this course. And so again, that would be the maxim that motivates your watching this video. Another might be, I just really love these videos about philosophy that Professor Hunterberger makes, okay? So you actually are watching the video for entertainment. I think that's pretty unlikely, but it's possible that that is what is motivating you, that that's the maxim that you're following. So there your maxim would be something like, I sometimes do things just for fun or for entertainment, okay? So if you think about pretty much anything that you do, and certainly anything you do that could be called deliberate or a choice or something where your will is involved, okay, then then you can describe or interpret that thing that you're doing in terms of some maxim that is the rule that you are following in doing that thing, okay? Now the maxim has to be something that is an accurate description of your motivations, right? It's not actually, so say that you give someone $10 because you want them to like you and be your friend, okay? Your maxim in that case is you want them to like you and be your friend. That's what motivated you to give them the $10. You would just be lying to yourself and to other people in that case if you said, well, I gave them the $10 because I could tell they really needed it, right? So the point there is what we say about what our motivations are or possible ways of describing our motivations aren't necessarily accurate. Okay, the real maxim that motivates our actions is whatever is really the motivation. Now, I'm not saying that you couldn't have the motivation to just help somebody out by giving them $10. I'm just saying that whatever your motivation is for acting in a certain way, that motivation described as a rule is the maxim for that action. So it's not that you can just freely redescribe any action however you like and make it so that you were motivated by anything that you like. We are actually motivated by one thing or another, and the maxim is a description of that motivation. It's a description of the motivation presented as a kind of rule, like when somebody needs help and I'm able to help them out, I help them. Therefore, I gave them $10. Or when there's an easy action for me to take that would lead to somebody I like liking me back, then I take that action. Therefore, I gave them $10, okay? I think that clarifies well enough what a maxim is. So now the last point I need to make about this is that the maxims that we act from and this thing that Kant is called the practical law, which is what morality will be if there is such a thing, are related in a certain interesting way, okay? So basically, in order to be moral, Kant is going to argue, our maxims need to satisfy the requirements of the practical law. In order to be moral, our maxims need to fall within the bounds of what is acceptable according to the moral law or the practical law, okay? And that is what it's like to act from a respect for duty or from a concern for duty, is for us to recognize that the practical law or the moral law requires that we behave in a certain way, and then to respond to that in our own action. In other words, to act from our maxims in a way that matches or meets what the practical law requires. And notice that Kant calls the practical law or the moral law the objective principle of volition, whereas he calls a maxim a subjective principle of volition. So by objective and subjective here, this is basically what Kant means. He means by objective that it applies just in itself. It applies for all time, for all people, regardless of their subjective desires or inclinations or whatever, okay? It is solid, like an object, okay? The subjective principle of volition, the maxims that we adopt, they vary from one person to another, right? So it's possible, because they have to do with subjects, that is us. So the word subject there refers to things like us, and these maxims can vary. They can vary from one moment to the next for a given subject. So which maxims we act from is a matter of our subjectivity. But what maxims we ought to act from is a matter of objectivity. It's a matter of this objective principle of volition, according to Kant, okay? So if there is such a thing as morality, and it's interesting that I keep putting it that way, because Kant himself admits at this point he hasn't yet proven that there really is such a thing as morality. He just is saying that if there is such a thing as morality, it's going to take the form of an objective principle of volition, some kind of standard of our behavior that applies always for all time to all of us, and that our subjective principles of volition must either meet or fail to meet. They must either satisfy or not satisfy, okay? And now Kant is going to give us more information about what this practical law actually is. That is, what are the standards for our decision-making in an objective sense? What are these objective moral standards? Okay, so he writes as follows. But what sort of law can that be, the conception of which must determine the will, even without paying any regard to the effect expected from it, in order that this will may be called good absolutely and without qualification? So here he's referring again back to the earlier stuff in the section about the good will being good not because of what it affects, but just good intrinsically. Okay, so he's asking, what kind of law can this be if it has to govern the will in terms of its intrinsic structure and not in terms of its effects? As I have deprived the will of every impulse, i.e. every object of inclination, which could arise to it from obedience to any law, there remains nothing but the universal conformity of its actions to law in general, which alone is to serve the will as a principle. So this is a weird kind of argument, but basically what Kant is saying is, if the will is going to be good just in itself and not because of what it affects, okay, not because of what it brings about, then it must be something especially abstract and not concrete. It must be something that could be articulated in a way that doesn't make reference to any particular result of the actions of the will, okay? And because of what we've described about the will so far, in terms of the will being guided by maxims or following maxims, and morality being this practical law, we really have not very much of anything to go on. All we have left to guide the will is the formal structure of the relation between this maxim and the practical law. Okay, so I know that's so complicated, and I apologize for that. If it's a little bit of a blur at this point, that's okay. Just try to hold on and catch the main points here, okay? So Kant's conclusion is that there's only one standard here that's left that can be the standard for morality. He says, I'm never to act otherwise than so that I could also will that my maxim, that is the subjective principle of my volition, or the rule that I'm following in deciding what to do, should become a universal law. Okay, so what he has in mind here is something like this. If I ever act from a maxim that couldn't be a universal law, that is something that everybody else followed, then I must be acting in a way that is immoral, because all I know about morality, the only defining characteristic of morality is that it is something that applies for all time to all wills, that it's something objective. So if there is an objective standard of morality, then the only, if there is an objective standard of morality, then one of its criteria is that we can't act in a way that couldn't be an objective standard of morality, okay? Another way to put that is we couldn't we can't legitimately or morally act in a way that we couldn't at the same time want everybody else to act from. And I will now look at an example that makes this clearer. So here is the example that Kant himself actually uses to make this point. Okay, and I'll describe it with a slightly colorful example. So imagine that a person is kind of having a hard time with money this week, and they see a friend on the street, and they say to the friend, or an acquaintance, I should say, and they say to the acquaintance, hey, it's good to see you, and they are chatting with them, and they say, listen, I know it's a little weird, but I'm having a hard time with money right now. There was a delay in my paycheck, and if you could lend me just like $50, that would really help me, and I could pay you back next week. I promise I will pay you back next week. And meanwhile, this person who's asking for the money from the other person is thinking to themselves, I'm not going to pay this person back. If they lend me that money, then they'll never see it again because I don't know them that well and I don't really care about them and I just need the money for my own purposes and I might not have it next week. So what I'm going to do, this person is thinking to themselves, I'm just going to promise them that I'll pay them back the money next week, but I actually have no intention of paying it back. Of course, they don't tell the other person this, right? So the question is this action that the person has taken a moral one? Well, I think probably most of us, like just thinking about it, might say like, it seems kind of immoral. They're lying to the other person. Seems kind of wrong, okay? And Kant would say, yeah, it's definitely wrong, okay? And why is it wrong? The principle that Kant has just given, which is his supreme principle of morality, or the categorical imperative, says that we should never act in a way that we couldn't at the same time will for everyone to act. So in other words, we shouldn't act from a maxim that couldn't be a universal law, a law that everybody follows. Well, let's run this test in this case. The maxim that the person who is asking money from the other person is probably following here, the maxim that they're following, is something like, when I am faced with a difficulty, I will make a false promise, for instance, a promise to repay some money in order to get something that will help me out of the difficulty. And so the question is that maxim one that everybody could follow? Is it one that the person who is making the false promise could want for everyone to follow at the same time that they make the false promise? And the answer here is no. And Kant explains this as follows. He says, then I presently become aware that while I can will the lie, I can by no means will that lying should become a universal law. For with such a law, there would be no promises at all, since it would be in vain to allege my intention in regard to future actions to those who would not believe this allegation. Or if they over hastily did, they would pay me back in my own coin, meaning they would just lie to me too. Okay, so the maxim, as soon as it should be made a universal law, would necessarily destroy itself. So this is a case where we see that the maxim that this person wants to act from in making a false promise is one that couldn't possibly be a universal law, because if everybody made false promises all the time, then this person wouldn't be able to effectively make a false promise. Okay, so that is the standard of morality according to Kant. And in fact, we'll see that he thinks that any situation where someone's behaving immorally can basically be described in the same way. That all cases of immorality are cases where someone is themselves acting from a certain maxim, but that maxim that they're acting from is one that couldn't possibly be acted on by everybody else. And that's what shows that the action is immoral. So I realize that that's a bit complicated, and we'll look at some more examples soon. For now, I just want to briefly read the conclusion of this argument from Kant. Okay, so he says, I only ask myself, canst thou also will that thy maxim should become a universal law? If not, then it must be rejected. That is, this whatever subjective principle of volition I'm considering adopting, whatever maxim I'm considering adopting. If it can't be a universal law, it must be rejected. And that not because of a disadvantage accruing from it to myself or even to others, but because it cannot enter as a principle into a possible universal legislation. And reason extorts from me immediate respect for such legislation. So the idea here is that the reason why it's wrong is not because it will lead to suffering for anybody. The reason that it's wrong is because it can't possibly be right. The only definition of something being right is that it's something that everybody could do. And so if I'm acting in a way that not everybody could act, or I'm acting from a principle, I should say, that not everybody could act from, then that by definition means that what I'm doing is immoral. And then Kant goes on to say, I do not indeed as yet discern on what this respect for the moral law or the practical law is based. This the philosopher may inquire, and Kant will actually go on to do that. So in other words, what he's saying there is, I don't yet know why I should believe that there is this practical law or this moral law. He's got to say more about why we should believe that. But at least I understand this, that it's an estimation of the worth which far outweighs all worth of what is recommended by inclination, and that the necessity of acting from pure respect for the practical law is what constitutes duty, to which every other motive must give place, because it is the condition of a will being good in itself, and the worth of such a will is above everything. So just to recap there, what he said is, I've shown that the good will is manifest in cases where we are recognizing some obligation that we have. And then I've also shown that if there is such a thing as an obligation that actually applies to us, if there actually is such a thing as duty or obligation, okay, then it must have the form of a practical law. And if it has the form of a practical law, then the standard for whether or not we've met that practical law is the categorical imperative, basically whether or not the maxim we act from is one that everybody could act from consistently, okay? And so that basically carries him to the conclusion. Now, what he has to do from this point, and what he'll begin to do in section 2, is say why we should believe that there is that, standard of morality. He'll also say a little bit more about how the categorical imperative works and how to apply it in specific situations. So with that, I will end these video lectures, which I admit are probably pretty challenging, and this reading's pretty challenging, but we'll be finishing up with this soon, and basically after we finish with Kant, I think the course is more or less downhill in terms of how much effort is required to understand the readings and the video lectures. Okay, so just do your best this week and the next, and then we will move on and it'll be slightly smoother sailing from there.